Hello and welcome to Ideas Having Sex with Chris Kaufman. I'm Chris Kaufman, and each show I bring to you an interesting and provocative scholar to discuss topics in social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you enjoy what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. Hey, everybody, and welcome to Ideas Having Sex. I'm Chris Kaufman, and today I'm joined by Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute and author of over 20 books, Johan Norberg, and we are discussing his new book, The Capitalist Manifesto, Why the Global Free Market Will Save the World. Johan, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So maybe 20 years ago, a little under 20 years ago, I had graduated college. Actually, I suppose it would have been like 2007. And I had long planned a trip. People routinely backpack through Europe. And I never really heard much about people doing that through the United States. But I didn't have the money to go to Europe. So when I graduated college, I wanted to do some like urban backpacking through the United States. At least I knew the language. And I referred to it as my Freedom March, reflecting partially my interest in libertarianism, but also being done with school. And so I took Greyhound buses and went all over the place. And I usually had like a book with me to kill time here and there. And it was a lot of fun. I met random people. But at one point early on, I found myself in a bookstore and I saw a little book called In Defense of Global Capitalism, which you had written in 2004. Is that right?
Something like that, yes.
So that was my first introduction to you. At that point in my life, I had read Milton Friedman, and I had read some of his son, David Friedman, and some Ayn Rand and some of her recommendations and such. And this was a book that jumped out at me as being interesting. And I read the whole thing really quickly. It kept me company while I was on buses and such. And I enjoyed it a lot. And I had not heard of you prior to that. So first of all, thank you for writing that book. And second of all, how would you say this next book, The Capitalist Manifesto, which you're writing some 20 years later, how are they similar? How are they different? What's the relationship between them?
That's a great question. And first of all, thank you for sharing that story. I'm happy I kept you company during all those long bus rides. And thanks for keeping an open mind for ideas like that. Yeah, I wrote that book a little bit more than 20 years ago because I wanted to talk about the most important issues that were facing the planet back then. How can we make sure to give as many people as possible good lives, opportunities, freedom, a life also free from poverty and hunger? And to me, I had discovered, and this was really something that I didn't originally believe, but I realized that this was because of capitalism and free trade and globalization. And I had to share that story with the world. And that was what the first book was about. And this book now, a bit more than 20 years later, is about the same thing. but I thought of it when I started writing it, I thought of it as how would I have written the first book in this new context with everything that has happened since and the new challenges that was facing our ideas, the free market and open societies generally, because things have changed dramatically and many things have changed. And there are many new aspects that I have to think about. But the most dramatic one is that back then, people said that no, we can't have global capitalism because the world is a zero sum game. And yes, we in the United States and in Western Europe, we will benefit from free trade and big business and multinational corporations and their foreign investments. But someone else is going to lose, and that will be the poor of the world. So we had a leftist anti globalization movement. And I was really trying to tell them in that book way back then that's not the case. The world is not a zero sum game. No deal on a free market happens unless both parties think that they will benefit from it. And growth and innovation is in everybody's interest. So please try to consider that. Now, 20 years later, people agree on that point, at least. Most people do. And not because of my book, but because they've seen the changes that have happened in the world. India, China, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Vietnam, countries that have begun to open up their economies, they've prospered more than they ever had. They've seen the fastest growth rates and the biggest poverty reduction the world has ever seen.
When I was young, people would always say, you better finish your food. There are starving kids in China. And they say that with Africa now, which is even they're
Yeah.
getting less true. But I never hear there are starving kids in China anymore. Not that no one starves, but that was a common saying that is no longer common. Sorry, go on.
Quite right. And even in sub Saharan Africa today, poverty rates are roughly where Western Europe was in the 1950s. So things are changing around the world. And if I sound distracted, it's because my cat just jumped onto my shoulders. But the problem is that the fact that people agreed on that point alone didn't convince them that global capitalism is a good thing. Because what happened was that they saw that, okay, apparently we were wrong. Apparently, free markets and free trade helps the poor of the world to prosper. However, they still think that the world is a zero sum game, that economics is a zero sum game. And if someone benefits, someone else has got to lose. And now, when they see that so many places around the world are growing faster than before, they think that we are losing out in the United States and in Western Europe. So, what I'm trying to say with this book is please try to understand before one of us dies. The world is not a zero sum game. The whole point is that growth and innovation is good and beneficial for everybody. So now I'm trying to look at all these ideas that, okay, it might have been good for the rest of the world with opening up economics, but we'll have deindustrialization back home. We'll lose all the good jobs for decent middle class jobs. It'll hurt the environment, it'll hurt lifestyles, and possibly even the meaning of life back home. So it's the same kind of approach to the world, but trying to take current controversies into consideration.
And obviously, updated data and all things that never stay current over 20 years. So it's a nice successor to that book.
Thank you. Yes, that's a problem when you write about the world's progress, is that it's difficult to keep track of everything that happens around the world because things are improving dramatically wherever people open up a little bit to new ideas and new business models and goods and services from other places. So you're going to have to update your books all the time.
There are two very important messages that come through in this book and in a lot of your writings. You wrote a great book called Open, another one called Progress. And these ideas, I would say, are, I'll summarize. One is the general empirical point that people like Matt Ridley and others, yourself, have also made, which is that contrary to popular belief, at least popular belief in many circles, the world has been getting better for a long time, very consistently and across a very large number of important metrics, not isolated little things. Increasingly, you have to zoom in and find isolated problems if you want to see world trends that are getting worse. The more broadly you zoom out, the more things you look at, the harder it is to find negative metrics. And this surprises people for a lot of reasons, probably because the news is the most common way most normal people learn about the world, and they have an incentive to, play stories that are interesting and gripping, and often they're bad. In a growing world, it's not hard to find horrible things that happen every day. Anyway, that's one point. The world is getting better. The other point is that freedom, capitalism, openness, etc., are amazing things for humanity. So can you connect these 2 points? Even if the world is getting better, let's say we accept that, why shouldn't we believe that it's just because we're getting smarter, more enlightened, or that wise government policies have improved living standards for us, etc.?
Yeah, the world is making rapid progress, but it doesn't happen everywhere. And that's something we notice. It's very easy to make broad correlations between the freedom of certain places and economies and their progress. And for example, the Economic Freedom of the World project of Fraser Institute and partners around the world shows this every year, showing that the fastest growth and the most impressive poverty reduction takes place in the freest countries. We have to look not just at aggregated levels. We should take a look at places that experiment with various policies in certain ways. We can see this historically, I mean, almost natural experiments. countries with the same history, same population, same language, but subtly exposed to different economic and political systems. West and Eastern Germany, one capitalist, one communist, one being the wonder of Europe, the other one being an economic nightmare. South Korea and North Korea. We can look at the Chinese in China before they started opening up economically under Deng Xiaoping, and the Chinese in Taiwan and Hong Kong, who are growing faster than in any other place. So we can look at historical examples like that. But we can also look at what's happening today around the world when countries are experimenting with alternatives to free markets. Venezuela being a recent example, the richest country in South America with massive oil wealth, then experimenting with the idea that we can just redistribute everything, just have government consumption for favored groups. And it's suffered a complete collapse, a GDP per capita rate, a GDP per capita collapsing by almost 70% in just a few years, and more than 6 million people fleeing to other countries, neighboring countries. So it's important not just to look at the broadest macro level, but actually seeing that policies make a difference. Wherever you give people a little bit of freedom, they begin to find ways of coming up with better ideas because they want to improve their lives and the lives of their loved ones. But if they're blocked from doing that, the result is often disastrous.
Can you say a little bit about how you're using the word capitalism? Some people who are maybe not familiar with this might bristle or not understand what's the connection between capitalism and freedom, the title of a Milton Friedman book. How are you defining capitalism, and why did you choose to go with that word as opposed to alternatives?
That's a great question because I'm not entirely happy with the title of my latest book, The Capitalist Manifesto, because it sounds like it's all about capital. And to some people, it sounds like it's power to the people who possess capital. And that's not what it's about. To me, what I'm talking about when I talk about free market capitalism is free markets. The fact that the economy is not centralized, there's no command and control of the economy. On the contrary, it's the millions and millions of people who are allowed to make their own decision on economic affairs. And probably we should call it something else. I often talk about it as free markets, where people like Deirdre McCloskey, who would like us to talk about it as since it's all about innovations, and that's great. I really appreciate that. Good luck to her and more power to her. However, I've noticed that people don't talk about innovism. They keep on talking about capitalism, and it seems to stick, this concept. And in that case, my simple take is that if we don't fill that word with meaning, others will. And the opponents of free markets will fill it with meaning. So I wanted there to be at least one book out there talking about capitalism in a positive sense for all those people going on Greyhound bus tours all over the United States and to find something that talks about capitalism in all its positive aspects. That's why I use the word and the relationship with freedom, because it's not a particular system built from the top. Capitalism, in the free market sense, is nothing else than freedom to act according to your own will and interests in the economic sphere, in everything that people consider to be economical, whatever that is, your job, what you choose to do to sustain yourself, whether you want to start a business, engage in exchange of goods, services, time, labor, all of those things, which are not distant from any other aspect of human life. It's just that when we engage in exchange, we often use money. We often talk about it as economical, but it's really all about what you do with your time, with your energy, and your life here on earth. So it's just one aspect of freedom.
Yeah, I don't always understand why a lot of people don't think about what you do in the economic sphere as, a legitimate area of freedom or that it pertains to freedom or that it's somehow a different sphere. Maybe an exception that I think ordinary people really do think about and understand is if you lived in a communist society or somewhat similar where you didn't have the ability to seek out and try to choose your own profession, that would be a huge infringement on your freedom. The freedom to seek out and choose your own profession, your own line of work, does seem like something that ordinary people think of as an important freedom, but I don't know. There's a lot of other.
Right. I think that's a great point. And this relates to something that Hayek, the Austrian economist, talked about, that lots of intellectuals appreciate freedom when it comes to theories, when it comes to thinking and talking. Lots of intellectuals, at least in theory, agree that those are important freedoms because they engage in those things. They think that's the primary realm of human agency, to think about important ideas and to communicate them. So they agree on that. But they don't think that choosing a profession and working and trying to sustain yourself and exchanging goods and services is dignified to the same extent. It's some sort of possibly a necessary evil or something. And talking about freedom to do such things, it's not as dignified as freedom of speech and of thought, but to others it is. You notice it when it's gone. And that's what I think that people in socialist economies remind us of when they fight so hard, desperately, to get those freedoms and to escape that oppression whenever they don't get it.
Yeah, Hayek has a really great point in the Constitution of Liberty where he talks about the freedom to actually do things economically, to start businesses and other kinds of things is so important to human life becoming better because you need people to blaze trails and go through with experiments in living to see what works, because not everything you try to do will work. And it's actually even more important than in ideas in a lot of ways because the consequences of failure are more important. So it's really important to have little failures here and there to figure out what works instead of having to just try one big thing collectively decided overall.
And that's a crucial point because, I love freedom of thought and speech, and I do it all the time. However, not everything that improves the world comes from theoretical ideas. Lots of it comes from acting and experiments and things that we haven't verbalized ourselves and perhaps we haven't thought of, but we just try and we do things, and most things fail, but some things work, and that changes the world for the better for all of us. That's what more of what economic freedom is about. We're testing, we're experimenting in so many different ways. We don't know where this is going to end. We just have to test and try and experiment and have trial and error again and again and again. And eventually something great happens. And that's a great reason to have freedom for things that we don't think of as very dignified, because if we want something new to come into the world, we can't predict what's important to test. And therefore, we cannot assume that there are certain realms where freedom is more important than others, at least if we're interested in something new.
And here's another point about that. This isn't just the freedom for entrepreneurs to develop new products. It's also the important freedom of wealthy people to purchase and consume those products because they can afford to waste their money on luxury goods that might turn out to suck. And if a bunch of rich people decide, oh, yeah, I'm going to go get Google Glass, check it out, that's cool, and it's obvious that it sucks, this way poor people didn't have to waste their money on it. Let the rich people who can afford to trailblaze in these experiments in living, and if it was really cool, Google would have kept going and they would have made better and cheaper versions of it, and then I might have bought it at some point, but I didn't have to because my rich friends did, and it wasn't that cool.
Yeah, I agree. That kind of spontaneous redistribution that goes on in the economy is one of the best aspects of it. And all the rich people, they waste their money and they have the trial and error. And then eventually you and I and the rest of the world can just go there and find what's already succeeded. And then it's come down in price so that we can afford it.
And I waste my money relative to, significantly poorer people on things that they probably wouldn't or shouldn't waste their money on. Anyway, moving on, for sure. There's a common belief that in the 80s, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher ushered in this unbridled era of neoliberalism or capitalism. And first of all, there's nothing unbridled about it. But can you say something about another false aspect of that story? It's actually the case that's a lot more economically left-wing parties and politicians really got this ball rolling before the 80s, before they did. And why don't they get credit for this? They should.
Yeah, I find an untold story about the changes that took place in the 1970s and 1980s, because with all its faults and all the obstacles to freedom and free markets around the world, things have really improved dramatically in most places. Even had the world average of economic freedom come back into the world today, it would probably have been one of the least free economies in the world. So, what changed? And some think it's this kind of sort of neoliberal conspiracy, the Reagans and Thatchers of the world who had this plan on how to change things. But that's not what happened. If you look at the greatest changes that took place around the world, it was disappointed communists in China and Vietnam who sort of said, look, this doesn't work. Let's try something else. Or social democrats in Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, for example, in India, they began to change their minds. And why do they do that? Because what they believed in just did not work. And it's actually the same thing with the Reagan and Thatcher revolution, or so called. Because before Reagan, who started the American deregulation, it was the Democratic president, Jimmy Carter, who started to talk about how we had to really remove all this unnecessary federal regulation and started to deregulate aviation, railways, trucking, and energy, and so on. And in Britain, it was Thatcher's predecessors in labor who started to say that, look, the old model didn't work. Just saying that we will continue to spend money on everything that we cherish without having growth, it'll just result in inflation and higher debts. So, to me, it's very important to revisit this story of the changes that took place in the world for two reasons. The first one is that it shows you that this was not just a theoretical idea and from an ivory tower. This came from actual results, looking at the failed model of big government and realizing it doesn't work, we're going to have to try something else. And the other reason is, of course, that things changed dramatically once we saw this wave of at least relative, not unbridled free markets in any ways, but at least a freer economy than we've had for around the world for 100 years or so, has created the greatest improvement in human living standard that the world has ever seen since 1990, probably something like 130,000 to 140,000 people have been lifted out of extreme poverty every day. And it happened the fastest in the places that began to open up their economies.
Hey everyone, this is Chris Kaufman. Just want to take a quick break to tell you all I appreciate you so much for listening to the show. And it's still a new show, still a growing show. And if you want to help me out, I would greatly appreciate it. Simplest thing you could do is recommend it to a friend and give it a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Their algorithms rank the shows higher, make it more visible, make it more searchable if it has more star ratings, more reviews. So anything like that would be very, very helpful. Thank you so much. I appreciate you all. Back to the show. You have some interesting criticisms to make of a few prominent modern intellectuals who are, I won't say they're all, probably not fair to say that they're all anti-capitalists. I don't know, but they have various critical things to say about capitalism as you're talking about it. So I wonder if you might say something briefly about each of these. I'm going to give you three different thinkers that you talk about and a brief summary of their thesis. So Thomas Piketty is very famous. What do you have to say about his claim that the wealth of the super rich is generally growing much faster than general economic growth, and so we're just seeing more and more concentration of wealth among the super rich?
Yeah, he's got it wrong. I've talked to Daniel Walden's Swedish economist, who is an expert in equality and inequality, and he's interesting not just because of his own results, but also because Piketty made a lot of use of his work. when writing his book, Capital in the 21st Century. Now, Daniel Waldenström is preparing his own book on this subject with filling in the blanks, the holes in the data sets, and coming up with a completely different story. And what he finds is that Piketty has done lots of guesswork and comes up with a faulty conclusion. What's happened over the past 100 years is actually not just that the world became much, much more rich, but also more equal in most ways. And that's an incredibly important story. And I hope that Waldenström gets at least 10% of the attention that Piketty got, because that will be enough to change this narrative. Piketty is obsessed with inequality because he has his own plan. He doesn't like capitalism and entrepreneurship, and he wants to tax them heavily, and he wants to present this idea that inequality is getting out of control. Waldenström's story is that actually the world is probably in most ways a more equal place than it's ever been, which to me sounds interesting.
Yeah, definitely globally it is. That's my understanding anyway. Even on his terms, where he's looking at within country inequality, I don't know if he has written anything to grapple with Walter Scheidel's book, The Great Leveler, where he basically claims that it's pretty normal for inequality to just be at a somewhat high, stable level or growing a little bit. That's the historical norm. And the only things that really change that in a dramatic way are huge destructive shocks. And he names like societal collapse, pandemics, transformative revolution, and mass mobilization warfare. His claim is that in the modern world, the rich world essentially experienced a dramatic leveling of wealth as a result of the world wars. And since then, it's just been kind of regression to the mean. That's mostly what the story is there. Okay, Mariana Mazzucato, another one. What about her claim that the state is needed in general to drive big, ambitious projects?
Yeah, she thinks that we need moonshots, as she calls it. The government could put a man on the moon in 1969, so why don't we do the same thing when it comes to, say, green technology or the new important businesses for the future, AI and what have you? I think she misunderstands how innovation takes place. She looks at the end results and she says, look, we like this end result. We like these businesses and these technologies. And it seems like businesses, they just push buttons and make it happen. So why don't they push it even more often? Why don't we get the government involved and heavily subsidize certain industries and then push this button and make it happen more often? I think this is a complete misreading of technological and entrepreneurial history. I think it's more complicated than that. It comes through trial and error and adaptation and feedback from the market, and then new experiments and restless investors and unhappy customers and lots of competition. And we rarely know what's going to end up triumphant in the end. Most businesses and entrepreneurs have no idea what's going to work, which technology will be superior, and so on. So the question is, why would governments know what will triumph in the end? They don't act on markets and they don't even risk their own money. So obviously they can do things and we'll see certain results. There will be jobs created wherever they subsidize something, but you don't see what didn't happen and what could have happened otherwise. The list of government failures when they invest in certain businesses is incredibly long. And that's fine, because lots of businesses fail, entrepreneurs fail, Google Glasses fail, and that's fine. But the problem with getting the government involved with the taxpayers' money is that you remove the feedback mechanisms that are essential to turn failure into a learning process, whereby we constantly channel capital, labor, and energy into the areas that work better than otherwise. So that's why I think that it's this idea of government moonshots. It's a little bit ignorant of how progress really happens.
Let me compliment for a second your writing style in addition to the thesis of the book. You're a very entertaining writer. I get shades of H.L. Mencken sometimes. You've got great
Mhm.
little one-liner asides that make me laugh. And one of them that cracked me up was governments are bad at picking winners, but losers are good at picking governments, which I think is kind of an illustration of what you're talking about here. Can you mention what you
Thank
made?
you.
You had like a tongue-in-cheek counter proposal for policy to Matsukado's idea that instead of having looking at the government to help with moonshots, we should be really focusing on the porn industry for helping to improve technologies because they've been so instrumental at improving so many technologies.
Yeah, I find it slightly amusing that Matsukato and many others who think that governments should get more praise for every innovation and every successful business model around the world. It seems like when you actually look at what happened, it's rarely mission oriented. It's rarely a great plan. We need this kind of project and we made it happen. It's more like, oh, this guy went to this publicly funded university and then came up with the idea, or the government bought some of their technologies and made it work. So it seems like it's not really mission oriented. It's more like the government almost touched a certain technology at a certain stage. And then the comparison that I wrote about is that in that case, if that's the standard, in that case, more praise perhaps should go to the porn industry because pornography has been instrumental in making much of modern communication technology to work, from movies and film photography, of course, but also the internet and online payment services, and now probably VR and AI and so on.
Robotics.
And exactly. And the government takes some 40% of GDP. The porn industry is like a couple of tenth of a percentage point of GDP. And yet it's still there, touching on every modern technology. So if I was more of this sort of activist, interventionist economist like Matsukato, I would say more money to the porn industry because it seems like they are able to innovate in a very dramatic and disruptive way.
What about David Graeber? David Graeber claims that so much of the modern capitalist world consists of bullshit jobs, in his phrase, that don't actually add to productivity. Is that true? Is it important?
There's lots of bullshit in the world, obviously. How do we make sure that we get less of it? Well, probably by having fierce competition between different businesses so that they try to get rid of wasteful jobs that just don't contribute. But I think that he is using statistics because he's using sort of polls where people talk about whether they make a difference, if their jobs are important. He's actually using polls of Britons, and lots of Brits say that their jobs don't make a meaningful contribution to humanity. I guess it's like 35, 37% or something like that. But does that mean that this is a bullshit job? It's making a meaningful contribution to humanity. That's a pretty high bar, especially when you talk to Britons who are kind of have a sense of humility and don't want to exaggerate their importance in life. So you can have a meaningful job that actually contributes to somebody else and creating important goods and services and opportunities to them, and perhaps even giving you some satisfaction as well, without making a meaningful contribution to humanity. We should be a little bit cautious in exaggerating the importance of what we're saying to posters. But fair enough. Some jobs are meaningless, so let's expose them to fierce competition. It's a great reason to have free trade and free markets.
Yeah, I didn't read Bullshit Jobs, but when I hear that, is it possible that it's just harder than you might think from the outside to measure productivity like that? I'm sure there are creative ways, and maybe it's true to a large extent. But there's a difficult social scientific project there of disentangling, are the causes uniquely capitalist? Are there fewer bullshit jobs in socialist economies, in less competitive traditional societies?
Yeah.
It seems likely to me, my first thought would be that the proliferation of bullshit jobs probably has a lot to do with regulatory bureaucracies within companies, HR jobs, things that are very likely to not exist or to exist in way smaller numbers in a genuinely free market. I assume a lot of jobs only exist to handle a regulatory burden.
Oh, certainly. And this goes back to Hayek. Do we even know what our jobs mean for other people? I think it's difficult to sit back relaxed in your office or in your apartment and really know what contribution you make to society. It's something that you can only sense by testing it and trade testing it and see what happens, whether people are really interested in what you're doing or not. And I think that competition is a great way of improving management to make sure that we get better organization of human labor so that it contributes more to others. We don't know that from the outset. We cannot see this from the ivory tower. We only see this when we expose ourselves to the harsh judgment of other people in markets.
Many critics of capitalism accuse businesses casually or maybe in actual academic articles of deliberately making products that are going to break or fail so that we have to keep buying more, coming back. It's known as planned obsolescence, fancy word for making bad things. So, granted that maybe this has happened occasionally, I don't know. Is it actually a common feature of capitalist economies? Is this something that we should really be worrying about?
It's interesting. I wrote about this because this is one of the areas where there seems to be an intuitive sense that something is wrong with the economy and with free markets. We're being cheated, we're being sold electronics which have this planned obsolescence. It'll break down at a certain point and we'll be forced to buy something else. Wouldn't we notice after a while whether this is something that's seriously wrong, whether we could buy something else that would last a longer time? I think we do. I think we notice all the time. And I think that's a reason why we're thinking so hard about our purchases. I mean, obviously, if we're buying incredibly cheap, I don't know, coffee makers or stuff like that, obviously it'll break down soon because they can't invest heavily in every single component so that it'll last a lifetime. But it's incredibly difficult to see. You know, France even has a law against planned obsolescence, and they've had a very hard time finding a single example of planned obsolescence. What they find is that, yes, you rarely think about how can you make this particular component last a longer time than the time that they expect that the product will last entirely because it's expensive. I can't do it from my ivory tower, and I don't think that French courts can plan how much we should invest in every single component, every single aspect of every home electronic device. But it's something that we notice on markets because if you sell things that break down, you'll have a bad reputation. If you expect that this is something that I'll use for just a season or two, then I won't invest much in it. So it's more about the wisdom of consumers than about the devious mindset of producers.
A topic that comes up a couple times in the book that has maybe divided pro capitalist types is intellectual property. So, how do you think about IP in general? Is it a capitalist system? Is it anti capitalist? Does it help us? Does it harm us on net?
Yeah, I'm open to arguments because this is a difficult trade off. I'm pro intellectual property because I believe in the moral case for property. It's basically John Locke's old classical liberal argument for property. If you mix your labor into something that's not owned by someone, you establish a property. Nobody else is allowed to invade. Well, you might do that when it comes to certain ideas as well and come up with combinations that didn't exist in the world before. You invest heavily, and nobody else should be allowed to take that idea away from you. They would have to negotiate a price to get you to license it for them. The argument I get, and I agree on this point from opponents of IP, is that, you know, it's non-invasive. Somebody else can use it without you losing it. To me, that seems like a reason why we underinvest in ideas because others use it constantly, and there's a reason to protect the investment of those who come up with radically new ideas. But I agree by that there's a difficult trade-off there. How do you defined what's a unique new idea with a certain level that deserves protection, I won't be able to give you the precise answer.
Yeah, it's difficult. Libertarians run the gamut in what they think of this. Lysander Spooner was a American individualist anarchist who, he was an anarchist, but he believed very strongly in perpetual intellectual property, which is much stronger than even contemporary government's license. So whatever the right answer is about it, which is difficult, do you think that, like, say, the contemporary, I don't know, America or first world, do you think that they are erring on the side of being too protective of intellectual property or too permissive of its copying? Or do you think they have it about right? Or is that too simplistic of a question?
Why would they have it just about right?
Yeah.
What would possibly be the reason? I think this is complicated. It might even differ between different forms of intellectual property. I do think that we have, and this I say with some slight hesitation as a writer, I think that we might protect intellectual property rights in ideas, artistic and intellectual ideas too much because we've constantly increased the protection and the time period and so on. Why did we do that? It was not because of any particular consideration of its value. It was for the simple reason that we had very heavily funded lobbyists who, like Walt Disney, who kept on pushing in that.
They finally lost Mickey Mouse.
And finally, let's make the most of it. But that to me tells me that it's probably not the rational cost benefit analysis that has come down on this side. It's probably more lobbyism. But of course, then when I say that, it tells you that there's probably some of that in other areas as well.
You mentioned maybe it's different for different types of IP. I think I'm probably less sympathetic to it than you sound to be. I'm actually more sympathetic to the moral argument than to the practical argument. It seems more intuitive that if you create something that obviously was unique to you, that maybe that gives you some kind of moral status to it. I don't know. But I'm not. Terrence Keeley, is that the guy? And Matt Ridley as well have persuaded me that the practical benefits are probably overblown. But I could see that the case for copyright morally seems stronger, or at least that there's a much stronger case that the book that you just wrote, the Capitalist Manifesto, is not something that someone else might independently create. I mean, someone else might independently write a defense of capitalism, but they're not going to write that book or anything even very, very close to that book. Whereas invention for patents, inventions do very commonly happen simultaneously because it's in the air, because everyone's drawing from the same thing. So that the moral case for an independent monopoly right to a patent seems a little weaker for that reason. No one is going to write the same novel on accident because it's in the air, even if two people both write a novel about maybe plane crashes because that's in the air. So I don't know.
That's a good point. Matt Ridley is a favorite of mine, and the name of your podcast is a tribute to him. And I think when he says something, it's worth taking seriously. And something that I've learned from him is that there's often a temporary coincidence where people come up with the same ideas at the same time, probably because of the accumulated level of knowledge and technological capacities at a level where things just happen, and often simultaneously in various areas. And obviously, if you're then giving intellectual property to just one of them, you basically robbed the other ones from it. That's definitely the problem.
Matt was gracious enough to not sue me when I named my podcast Ideas Having Sex. So I'm forever in his debt.
That's brilliant. Didn't he get it from Hemingway originally?
Oh, I don't know.
Didn't he say sort of, ideas are like rabbits? You get one and you get another one, and then suddenly you have.
I'd have to rewatch the TED. I don't remember if does the phrase originate in his TED Talk or in The Rational Optimist. He said The Rational Optimist was almost called Ideas Having Sex, and those two titles went back and forth for a little while. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, it's a brilliant concept. And you never forget it when you hear it.
Yeah, no, it's great.
It helps me to navigate the world.
Another great quote related to intellectual property that I got from David Friedman. I think he said at one point, when you're young, you're worried that people will steal your ideas. And when you're old, you're worried that they won't.
Right.
So environmentalism. A lot of people who are otherwise sympathetic to free markets and capitalism nevertheless have a large concern about environmentalism, maybe climate change in particular, but it doesn't just have to be climate change. And to some extent, the reason is obvious. You can be sympathetic to the arguments for capitalism and free exchange, and some of the best arguments have to do with the mutually beneficial nature of exchange. If we make some kind of trade, we only engage in it assuming it's voluntary, if we both believe that we're going to benefit from it. So that means you have this giant accumulation of economic interactions that are happening. Each one makes the people involved a little bit better, a little bit better. So it's this constantly rising tide. And that argument is pretty sound as far as it goes, but it only applies to the people involved in the exchange. If you and I make a trade, we're both better off. But that says nothing about whether what we do makes Sam better off down the road. And you need the assumption that you and I are the ones who are bearing all the costs and benefits of this interaction. And to a first approximation, that's probably true in a bunch of cases. To the extent it's not true, it's maybe a rounding error. Or it's not true in ways that we don't think are important, like somebody else doesn't approve of the fact that you sold me a Playboy or something like that. But environmental concerns are a great example where this may not be the case. I may engage in some business activity that pollutes, and I'm not bearing the full cost of my action if I'm putting smoke into the atmosphere. I'm dirtying your shirt collar, I'm making the environment worse, I'm contributing CO2, etc. So environmental concerns are often brought up as like a Trump argument, or at least an argument where free markets need to be significantly curtailed in some way. And you've got a whole chapter addressing this, which is great. I think any responsible book should, that's defending free markets. I don't know. That's too much preamble, probably. I really just wanted to ask about the environmental Kuznets curve, which is a really interesting idea. And can you explain what it is? How confident are we that this is a real phenomenon? And does this kind of short circuit the argument that I just made against markets?
No, I agree with the preamble. We do have a problem there. Traditionally, if there's just two parties to an agreement, then nobody else should get involved and tell people what to do. But if you impose a certain cost, if this agreement comes at the cost of somebody else, then they have a reasonable stake and reason to tell them what to do and what not to do. And traditionally, we solved that because there weren't much of commons and we had to take care of our own trash in a way. Nowadays, we have higher smokestacks and we have ways of polluting other areas. And then there is a legitimate reason for others to say, in a perfect free market economy, they would go to court and say that, look, you've imposed certain costs on me, the sea, where I fish, the air that I breathe, and so on, and I want something to be done about that. In a non-perfect world with higher transaction costs, we're going to have to take care of those externalities in another way and try to imitate a market by imposing costs on those who pollute, and preferably, I think, by compensating those who lose out. I think that polluters should pay for the damage they do, and they should pay to those who are damaged, not to sort of into the coffers of the government generally. But that's the theoretical approach to it. What do we do about this policy-wise? Then the interesting question is, where do we do this? Where do we ever deal with these environmental externalities? And it turns out that we're doing that in the richest and freest economies on the planet. And this goes to your Kuznets curve for the environment question. Because what happens traditionally when it comes to most pollutants, most environmental problems, is that the moment we get richer, we begin to damage the environment because we start doing things. It's a great thing that we're doing things. That's how we survive. That's how we put food on the table of our kids and send them to school and get out of poverty. But the problem is when we do things, we also use resources and we pollute. We use energy sources, often fossil fuels, that impose costs on others. So when we start getting richer as a society, we often increase damage to nature. But then there is also overwhelming evidence that when it comes to most forms of pollutants and environmental damage, doesn't happen at the same time, doesn't happen in the same way, but almost all of these pollutants start to come down once we've reached a certain threshold, once we've become sufficiently rich as a society. And one simple reason is that as we get richer, we don't have to choose between putting food on the table or protecting the forests. But once we get richer, we can do both, and we can afford the technologies and the systems that impose less of a cost on nature. And this seems to be in almost every area of environmental damage, even though it happens at different points in time. It seems to be an overwhelming relationship. The richer we get, the better we are at taking out the trash.
So the curve is we get richer, we pollute more, we damage the environment more, and at a certain point we get rich enough that our priorities change maybe, but we can afford to add new priorities. We've handled our most urgent requirements, and now we can start looking at more high-minded or spiritual or loftier goals, such as environmental beauty or things like that. And whatever the rationale is, the fact is that countries get richer, they pollute more, they get a certain point, they pollute less, and they clean up more, and the richer countries in general in the world are actually on the right side of this curve. Is that about right?
That's right. One of the best things with having money is that you don't have to care about money as much. The most materialist societies are the poorest societies because you have no alternatives. You do whatever it takes to put food on the table. You should. That should be your overriding priority. But the richer countries get, the more we can keep more than one idea in our mind at the same time.
This is maybe a more detailed question, and you can skip it if you want. We have the aggregate results that point to the Kuznets curve as being a factual description of a certain economic and environmental trend. Do we know much about the specific mechanisms that cause it? Is it that richer countries can afford a more invasive regulatory state? If so, that's something that capitalist types are probably not going to be as excited about, or is it just that we use cleaner technologies or whatever? What are the specific mechanisms that cause this?
Yeah, it's a combination and it differs. And even when it comes to government policy, it differs, I think, because to me, as a libertarian, there's still a role for the government to make sure that polluters pay for the damage that they do. Unfortunately, in most cases, the money just ends up in government coffers rather than compensating those who've been damaged. But at least putting a price on particular pollutants, I think, is a reasonable way of dealing with environmental damage. So that's one thing that happens. But it's also, unfortunately, often sort of just the regulatory state. But there are also other aspects than the government and the fact that we can afford new technologies, that we level up to new technologies. We switch refrigerators and cars to the latest standard and they're better. So it's complicated. But what I do think for the future of the planet is that what's going to change everything and what's going to take care of the environment, it's not these regulations, because most of the damage in the future is obviously taking place far away from our countries. In the still growing countries, some in Asia, in the future in Africa, and so on, they're not going to change their minds or policies because we say so. They're going to change when green technologies are cheaper than what they have now, because then they will change not because they listen to us, not because they care about the environment, but because it's in their economic self-interest to do so.
Yeah, so practical economic market forces and technological development may be where all the action is anyway. But nevertheless, I want to ask, so John Hasnas has a forthcoming book called Common Law Liberalism, which is great. And I'm going to talk to him about it soon. But a big part of that book is to make the case that the common law is an amazingly flexible and evolutionary system of legal rules that responds to concrete, real world human conflicts, and that it's far more capable of handling big, complicated problems, even though it's a little bit messier than a lot of people give it credit for. So I'm wondering, do you think you're pessimistic about the ability of lawsuits and, say, tort liability to develop legal rules that create property rights or other social forms that tend to address these problems in ways, even if it takes longer and it's messier. Are you pessimistic about that relative to, say, a regulatory answer?
I'm going to have to read his book, I think, before I come up with a precise answer. But I do think that we have a problem when it comes to global environmental problems.
Yeah, this wouldn't apply to
It,
non. This is a hard problem for
it's
yeah.
it's easier to deal with the forest out there and the river out here. We can see the court cases there and how that sets a new precedent and so on. It's more difficult with this case with a couple of billions of people being affected marginally by something. It's the mother of all class action suits.
Yeah.
I'd be interested in seeing that, but it's probably some difficult transaction costs involved.
I mean, not to concede too much to the opposition, but climate change is like a perfect example of something that would be maximally difficult and maximally harmful for a free market system to manage. If the problems are all as advertised, I'm very heartened by a graphic that Alex Epstein has made very popular, showing that deaths from climate related disasters have been steadily falling dramatically over the last 100 years, fallen by like 95% in absolute and relative numbers, which is crazy, which shows that even if things are getting worse, we are getting so much better at managing the problems. From a human welfare point of view, it's maybe not the disaster we think it is.
Yeah, and that's my reading as well from the data. I think we've reduced the risk of dying in a climate related disaster by more than 90% since the 1950s or something like that. And that's not because we have fewer climate related disasters, it's because we're richer. We have more knowledge and more technological capacity. And that tells us something incredibly important. We don't just have negative externalities, we have positive externalities as well from our actions. Whatever people do to increase the level of knowledge and technology and wealth on the planet, that's an incredible positive externality. It doesn't just help them, it helps us to deal with any kind of problem we're facing, including climate related problems. So, yeah, there's some cause for hope as well.
Yeah, and government action also has externalities. And as I think David Friedman points out a lot, market failure is a big problem for the market, but it's an even bigger problem for government. It's the exception on the private market and the rule on the public market, because you have people making decisions that don't directly affect them. You know, senators and congressmen are not directly bearing the costs of their decisions. What developments in the contemporary world do you find most hopeful for the future of human freedom?
Well, to me, it's not about how policies change and government action in certain places. It's what I see when people improve their own lives and thereby accidentally improving our lives as well. I look to technology and I look to science and I look to new business models. And I get incredibly encouraged because that's where the action is. When I read the science papers, to me, that's science fiction. Things that go on in robotics and AI and space exploration and so on, things we couldn't have dreamt about just a few years ago. And that to me is hopeful because it's difficult to change policy, but we can circumnavigate it and come up with better solutions. And that brings me hope.
What books would you recommend as a good complement to A Capitalist Manifesto?
It depends on what you're looking for. If you want the best introduction to economics, I think it's Frederick Bastiat, the 19th century French economist, and his
Which book in
essays.
particular?
I think if there's a book, it's Economic Sophisms. And unfortunately, every single essay there is a brilliant and entertaining and funny refutation of everything that's being said by Democrats and Republicans in the United States right now
He's
about
very
economics.
literary. They're almost like Swiftian
Yeah,
satires, each essay.
yeah. And it's disturbing to me how relevant those essays are to contemporary debates about industrial policy and protectionism and stuff like that. He's absolutely brilliant. So if there's a book, it's Economic Sophisms. If there's an essay, it's what is seen and what is not seen. If you read that, I think it was Hayek who wrote about it. just reading that essay will give you a frame of reference to understand economics and refute every single myth in present debates as well.
It's really good. And it's longer, but I loved reading Economic Harmonies. That book had a really big impact on me when I first read it.
Yeah.
Okay, but
Yeah,
that's
no,
great.
it's wonderful. I agree.
It's hard to do better than Bastiat.
And if you want to move on from there
Sure, yeah.
afterwards, when you get that, it's like, I think reading Hayek, that will also give you a broader frame of reference for the entire society. And which one? Anyone. Some of his essays on knowledge and the use of knowledge in society and so on. I think the Constitution of Liberty is a great work.
I was expecting it to be like a slog. I feel like a lot of people talk about Hayek like he's brilliant, but like he's not a very great writer. Like Mises is much easier to read. Plenty of authors are more pleasant to read, but I actually didn't. I thought Constitution of Liberty went down pretty easily. What are you working on next?
It's a great one. My next work is studying history on history's golden ages and what we can learn from their rise and fall. Why is it that we, in certain places at a certain point in time, we had this cultural flourishing, an era of technological innovation, and often economic growth? And why did it end? And why did people return to those areas just a few decades later and it was all gone? The spark was gone. What can we learn from that today? That's my next project.
Do you have a rough publication estimate for that?
It'll probably take a year until I'd say the spring of 2025, something like that.
Awesome. Hassle you when that comes out.
Please do.
And where can people find you if they want to keep up with your work?
I don't know where to find me. It's just
go to
a decent search engine. I do have a website, johannorberg.net, to go to the Cato site and look me up and things like that. But I've realized that if you want to find more of my work, it's easier just to Google me and look at YouTube because there's so much there that I didn't plan. It's very Hayekian in this way because things happen on various platforms and I don't even know where to find it.
My guest today has been Johan Norberg, and his book, once again, is The Capitalist Manifesto, Why the Global Free Market Will Save the World. Johan, thank you so much for joining me on Ideas Having Sex.
Thank you. This was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Ideas Having Sex, where we have stimulating conversations on social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you're a fan of what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. I'm Chris Kaufman. Thanks for listening.